just last week we started with Daniel and this idea of what does it look like in scriptures. We find the children of Israel, the people of God, no longer in the promised land, but set in exile. Not necessarily out of the will of God. This is God's sovereignty moving them into exile. And how do they still be the people of God without the temple, without seemingly the promises that they were living under, or the kingdom? How do we continue to maintain our identity as a people of God while living in exile?
We get this, right? When we look around our world, right? We see peoples within nations. Right? An example would be our current situation in Iraq right now. There's a whole bunch of fighting that's still going on, and a lot of that is fighting between peoples within the nation. So the Kurdish people who live in the north of Iraq have been there for centuries and centuries. They have their own language and culture. They're a group of people, but they're living in the nation, the political state of Iraq. And so what you have is you have Israel, who were a people who have been carried away because of their rebellion, and now they find themselves in another nation, a political state called Babylon. And they're there by God's design. They're there because they misbehaved. They were warned over and over and over again. They rebelled. They were hard-hearted. They didn't listen. And so this people of Israel end up in captivity in the nation of Babylon. All through Scripture, though, you find that God has a people. So your people may be your ethnicity, right? Oh, my people are from Texas, right? That's a whole country. Did you know that? That's the nation of Texas. So your people may be. You ever people say that? My people are from Mississippi, right? Or my people are from Mexico. My people are from Puerto Rico. I was with a guy last night at a wedding, and he was from Puerto Rico, just sharing about his family down there after the hurricane and what was going on with his people. God's always had a people. In fact, Peter would refer to these people all the way back in the New Testament in chapter 2, verse 9. And it says about you and I here, you and I are a chosen people, a royal priesthood, a holy nation. Isn't that cool? You're a chosen people, a royal priesthood, a holy nation. You're God's special possession. And you're here. The reason you're on the earth, the reason we're on the earth is that we would declare the praises of Him who's called us out of darkness into His wonderful light. So the thing we have in common is not our ability to make great cornbread or tacos but our thing we have in common is we're called to show forth the praises of Him who called us out of darkness.
These people of God have also always found themselves held in tension or in opposition to the rest of the world, because they have a certain set of beliefs that are not common. They're very uncommon, and it sets them apart. And sometimes being set apart's a good thing, but oftentimes being set apart is not a good thing, right? You're not just other, you're in opposition. And that's how the children of Israel often found themselves. They were in opposition. And throughout Scripture, who they were in opposition to, even when there wasn't, even in the New Testament, when there wasn't a Babylon to really reckon with, it was still represented by this place called Babylon. From the Tower of Babel on, it was the city in opposition to the will of God. And now the children of God are brought in captivity into Babylon itself, through the city gates and into the city that has set themselves against God.
I think this is interesting for us and important for us as a church. The church in the U.S., if you weren't here last week, we set that up with this idea that the church in the U.S. is in a struggle for its identity. Now, I'm talking maybe particularly about the Pacific Northwest. If you're from the Bible Belt, you may feel like, hey, Christian culture is still strong and we're on top of things and we're still respected. But the church in the Pacific Northwest in particular, and I believe in North America and the West in general, is in a sense being challenged to figure out who they are. There's a guy by the name of Jonathan Sacks. He's a Jewish author and scholar, and he's written several articles. But in this one article on being a creative minority, he writes these words. And he's referring perhaps to the nation of Israel, because if you watch, Israel went up and down. They were all over the map as far as their relationship with God. and whether they were free or enslaved. But the one thing they held on to was their Jewishness. And I want us to look at this morning through the eyes of being believers, through the eyes of being Jesus followers. But he says this, a creative minority, being a minority is not easy because it involves maintaining strong links with the outside world while staying true to your faith. See what he's saying? So I have to continue to operate in this real world that I find myself. A lot of us here this morning, you have to operate in this real world of education or business or law enforcement or whatever your particular area is. And around you in those areas, maybe a lot of people who don't love the gospel, don't care about your Jesus, and don't care about church at all. And so he says we want to maintain those links and seeking not merely to keep the sacred flame burning, but also to transform the larger society of which you are a part. What he's saying here is that even if you're in captivity, you can see yourself as a missionary to the culture. We're on mission from God. My circumstances have carried me away here, but I know that even here, God is with me and I have a mission, and God is, these people, my circumstances are not bigger than my God. Boy, if you could almost go home and think about that all week long. Wherever you are, even if you feel like you are under siege, people don't like your Jesus, don't like you, don't like church, don't like Christianity, you're there for a reason because God has placed you there in His sovereignty.
So we said clear last week, there's two mistakes we can make. You can think of them as ditches on either side of the road. If you veer to one side or the other, you're going to fall into one of these ditches. The first ditch would be withdrawal and isolation. In other words, we're a minority, we're outnumbered, and we're held in opposition to this great big force of Babylon. We better circle the wagons and make sure that we just maintain our identity. Why is that a mistake? Because then the salt and the light never leave our community. And the other side is to compromise and fall into what we call syncretism, which means that we become so much like Babylon that there's no difference between us and them, and our light is blown out. Remember that song we used to sing when we were little kids, This Little Light of Mine? Right? We all sang that. This little light of mine, I'm going to let it shine. I'm going to let it shine, let it shine, let it shine. And I'm not going to let Satan do what? It out. That's syncretism.
You guys were there.
Right? I haven't protected it at all. And they can just come and gone. You're like everybody else. You're darkness now. But I also can't what? Hide it under a bushel. Right? If I hide it under a bushel, then it does no good to anybody but me. It is still light, but it's not light to anyone but us. And those are the two ways that we can fail as a minority.
I would challenge you that have been believers in this room for more than 20 years to look back over the last 2 decades of our culture. And I think what you'd find is we were more likely to go in the former ditch 20 years ago. Now, I'm not knocking homeschooling or private education. Listen, we have a Christian school here. We believe in discipleship. It's part of our mission. But man, 20, 25 years ago, there was this huge movement on to homeschool our kids, and public education was going down the tubes, and culture seems to be shifting. I'm talking the 70s and 80s, maybe 90s now, and we're going to circle the wagons, and I think the pendulum swung quickly to that side. If I look over the last 5 years, I think the pendulum has swung the other direction. I don't think we're in danger of hiding from the world. I think we're in great, great danger of being just like them. I think we're in great danger of having been absorbed by them, so that when someone looks at us, they're like, I don't really see a lot of, when I look at habits and lifestyle, language, and so forth, I don't really see. And somewhere in the middle is this Jesus road. In the middle is this Jesus who is not intimidated by either one. And He calls us to follow Him.
This is going to sound crazy and maybe a little bit old-fashioned, but that's me. I used to hear a phrase. It was a part of a Christian's vocabulary, and it would sound something like this. No, thank you, I can't do that. I'm a believer. It was a thing that would come out of our mouths sometimes. It would say, yeah, thanks, but no thanks, I can't do that. Basically, I'm a Christ follower, I'm a Christian, I can't do that. And now, honestly, when I hear that from young people, they're saying it like a joke. As if, of course, I can do that. I have complete freedom to do that. As if the compromise doesn't exist, or to compromise means nothing. But compromise is opening the door to something that wounds us, wounds our consciousness, and really kills the creativity side of the creative minority. Compromise is to give into or accept standards that we know are lower than is desirable.
So this morning, or for the next few weeks, we're going to unpack the book of Daniel, chapters 1 through 6. Chapters 7 through 12 are full of prophecy and lions and visions and all kinds of wild, crazy things. But we are going to really focus on chapters 1 through 6. I would challenge you in your reading this week, I don't know where you are in the Bible reading, but read the first 6 chapters of Daniel. It is packed full of interesting stuff of what it means to be a minority in a culture that perhaps doesn't believe as you do. So in chapter 1, we're going to read a few things, then we'll come back and give you the end. In the 3rd year of the reign of King Jehoiakim, king of Judah, this Babylonian king named Nebuchadnezzar came to Jerusalem and he besieged it. And the Lord delivered Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand, along with some of the articles from the temple of God. These he carried off to the temple of his God, small g, in Babylon, and put in the treasures, the house of his God. And so you have this king coming, carrying the people of God and the things of God's temple away. In that culture, in that Old Testament culture, the temple was the place where people could come and experience the presence of God. Now, I want to make note to something Jason mentioned earlier, that Babylon was a political place. It was a nation. In fact, it was a city-state. It wasn't really a big piece of property. It was just a giant city. In fact, if you were to look up a map, I think we had a map somewhere, but you'll find that you look at little old Israel right there, and Babylon was in what is now modern-day Iraq, but Babylon itself was just a little corner of that country. But it was an impressive city. The walls were 25 plus feet thick. It was famous for its modern wonder, or the wonders of the ancient world, its hanging gardens. It was famous for architecture and astronomy and all kinds of things. It was a very, very developed culture. But Babylon, throughout the Bible, is not only a place, it's a structure of authority. You'll find from Genesis 11, where we find the Tower of Babel, all the way to the book of Revelation, Babylon representing the anti-kingdom. Babylon is an archetype, if you will, of a structure of authority aligned against God. That's important to remember.
The Babylon that you find in Revelations, 3 chapters of Revelations is dedicated to Babylon. 3 chapters of Revelation is dedicated to a place that was no longer a world power. But it seems to have morphed in Revelations into something more than it ever was. It was always a city set in opposition to God, but now it seems to become a global economy. I challenge you to read it. It's really interesting. It looks like it's more than just a city. It's talked about as a city, but it's a global economy that drives the desires of the world. It's talked about as a harlot. It's enticing. It's beautiful. There's something about it. There's a dream, a way of living in Babylon that is presented as beautiful, and yet the Scripture shows the ugly underside of it. And guys, who drives the economy of the world today? Where does that come from? Why might we consider that we ourselves are living in a modern day Babylon? That there are aspects of this city that is true of America today. That's a whole other sermon that we probably need to get into someday, but not today. But just think about the fact that this isn't a long stretch of the imagination to imagine that the place that Daniel found himself in at that time, we can identify with pretty well today.
So in Daniel, it says, the king ordered Aspenaz, chief of the court officials, to bring into the king's service some of the Israelites from the royal family and the nobility. He said, bring me young men without any physical defect, handsome, showing aptitude for every kind of learning, well-informed, quick to understand, and qualified to serve in the king's palace. He's looking for the best and the brightest. And he was to teach them the language and the literature of the Babylonians. Literature would be the history. In those days, oral history was basically the rule of thumb. A lot of things weren't written down as we know them today. It was oral history, so you were sat down and you were tutored in the ways of the nation you found yourself in. And the king assigned them a daily amount of food and wine from the king's table. They were to be in that school for 3 years, and after that they were to enter the king's service. And among those chosen were some from Judah: Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. The chief official, however, gave them new names. To Daniel, the name Belteshazzar; to Hananiah, Shadrach; to Mishael, Meshach; and to Azariah, Abednego. And so what you have here is this shift. We're going to take the best and the brightest, and we brought you to our new nation state, this new way of living and thinking. And now we're going to teach you our ways, and we're going to actually change your names a little bit. But it says in verse 8, and here's where we come in this morning, the compromise. Daniel resolved not to defile himself with the royal food and wine. He asked the chief official for permission not to defile himself this way. In the Jewish culture, there were all kinds of regulations as to food and so forth, food and drink. Whole other story. You can read it way back in Leviticus and Deuteronomy and Exodus. But Daniel said no. He said, I'd rather trust. He appealed to this official and said, trust me. Now God had caused the official to show favor and compassion to Daniel. Cool side note, that even in captivity, God is still at work. But the official told Daniel, I am afraid of my lord the king, that's my boss, who assigned your food and drink. Why should he see you looking worse than the other men your age? He would have my head because of you. So you hear this official, this kind of guy stuck in the middle. My boss told me to do this to you. You're telling me, trust me, I'll come out ahead. But if it doesn't work, I'm going to lose my head over this.
Yeah, right, because of graft. It's a real thing that exists. And I'm sure he was afraid, look, if I'm not feeding you guys, they're going to assume that I'm selling this food on the market and pocketing the money. Like, you need to prove something to me. And that's exactly what happens. In verse 11, Daniel then said to the guard, whom the chief official had appointed over Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, okay, put us to the test for 10 days. Like, this is a very scientific experiment. I like it. It's beautiful. Put us to the test for 10 days. Give us nothing but vegetables to eat and water to drink. Then compare our appearances with that young men who eat the royal food, and treat your servants in accordance with what you see. They're not really even asking for much favor. They're like, just let us do it our way. If in 10 days we're wrong and you're right, then you can say, nana, 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 I was right and you were wrong.
Brisket was the way to go.
Yeah, but put us to the test and let's see what happens. So he agreed to this test and tested them for 10 days. And at the end of 10 days, they looked healthier and better nourished than any of the young men who ate the royal food. So the guard took away their choice food and the wine that they were to drink and gave them vegetables instead. To these 4 young men, God gave knowledge and understanding of all kinds of literature and learning. And Daniel could understand visions and dreams of all kinds. And at the end of the time set by the king to bring them into the service, the chief officials presented them to Nebuchadnezzar. And the king talked with them, and he found none equal to Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. So they entered the king's service, and every matter of wisdom and understanding about which the king questioned them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and enchanters in his whole kingdom. And Daniel remained there until the first year of King Cyrus, which is to say, Daniel, from the time he came into exile to the time he left, 70 years, the entire time he held a position at court. It might have went up and down a few times, as we'll see in a lion's den, but there's never a time that he wasn't needed in the kingdom.
Now here's where we want to bring it home for us. Listen carefully, watch carefully. You know what you see in these last verses, if you put them back up there, is what you see is this 2 sides of, I think, a very important and inseparable coin. One side of the coin is you see Daniel playing defense, where Daniel says, I know what you're trying to do to me. I know you want me to become one of you. I know you want to erase my Jewishness and use my gifts for your purposes, and I'm not going to allow you to do that. Trust me, let me eat my own food and so forth. So he's playing defense, which is very important. But anybody who's played sports know that if all you play is defense, it's just a matter of time before you're scored upon and you lose 1-0, right? You have to play offense. And so Daniel not only played defense and protected himself from being absorbed, but then he also played offense and said, I'm not just going to sit here and wait for deliverance and wait for God to spring us from Babylon. I'm going to use the gifts I have in Babylon to honor God. And so Daniel becomes 10 times all the other astrologers, all the other magicians, all the other seers and so forth. Daniel becomes like this respected man of God, this respected Jewish guy. in this heathen, if you will, this anti-God culture. It's interesting. Well, we'll get into that in just a second. I don't want to jump ahead.
I think about what he just said. Then all the other magicians, how were they seen? They were seen as just another one of you seers, of you magicians. This school that they went to for 3 years to learn the language, this was some Harry Potter stuff going on right here, but much, much darker. Like, how do we read the entrails of this goat that we just split open? How do we read these tea leaves? What about the incense and the way the smoke goes up? And every day they must have been put to the test and challenged and said, either our God is better at interpreting dreams than these demons and these little g gods, or he's not. And turns out, surprise, surprise, the God of the universe that created everything is better at this than all the magicians of the Babylonians. And they put that themselves to the test every day without compromise. That is incredibly important. We should meditate on these scriptures and look at these regularly and say, Lord, how do I fit myself into the defense and the offense like they did? How do I become so good at being your man that I'm better than the worst?
It's so, during the worship time, when we sing songs like I Believe in You and God of Miracles, when I'm here with my community, and we all sort of agree for the most part, that just seems like a natural thing for us to sing and say. Listen to the words of Jeremiah. We read this last week, but I want to refer to it again. These are the words of Jeremiah to this group of people from his perspective as a prophet. This is what the Lord Almighty says, the God of Israel, to all those I've carried from Jerusalem to Babylon. Here's what I want you to do there in captivity. Build houses, settle down, plant gardens, eat what they produce. Marry, have sons and daughters, find wives for your sons, and give your daughters in marriage, so they too may have sons and daughters. Increase in number, do not decrease. Don't go backwards, continue to go forward. Seek the peace and the prosperity of the city to which I've carried you into exile. Pray for it, because if it prospers, you too will prosper. What a concept. How many times have we found ourselves in a foreign place, let's just say your occupation, your job, where you're surrounded by unbelievers, non-believers, even hostile to the faith, the Christian faith. And God seems to say, pray for that place that I've sent you. Have you ever felt like your job is exile? Like, oh, I just can't wait to get out of here. You don't know what the atmosphere is like in my office or in my site, my construction site. You don't know what the language is like. You don't know what the attitudes are like. What if we looked at that and said, oh gosh, what if God has sent me there? And you find yourself one day listening to the office gossip and whatever, and you hear that song play in your head. I believe in you. You're the God of miracles. And I'm not in church. And these people think I'm crazy. But could I pray for you right now? This thing I heard you say, this thing about your family, I know your marriage is really in trouble. I know your finances. I know you're struggling with your health. I'm a believer in Jesus. I'm not asking you to come to my church, but could I pray for you? I'd like to believe God for a miracle. People would just fall off the chair. They would just freak right out. But what if you and God stepped out on that limb together? I mean, come on. What if you and God and I stepped out on that limb just together? God said, I want you to pray. I'll take care of it. Don't worry about your reputation. Just step out on that together. You know, Jonathan Sachs, in the same article on creative minority, says, you know, you can be a minority living in a country or a place whose religion, culture, and legal system are not your own, and yet sustain your identity, live your faith, and contribute to the common good, exactly as Jeremiah said. It isn't easy. And here's the part I like. It demands a complex finessing of identities. Because I'm a believer at heart. This is my core identity. But over here, I have to be a supervisor. Over here, I have to be X, Y, or Z. It involves a willingness to live in a state of cognitive dissonance. Let that phrase sink in for a second. To live in a state of cognitive dissonance. You know what that means? It's like I'm listening to two things at the same time. I'm living life on two channels. On one channel, I don't like what I'm hearing. On the other channel, I love this. But you know what? I'm going to live in this spot, uncomfortable as it is, because I am on a mission from God. And so I don't have to have Christian music playing in the background all the time. to maintain my identity of who I am in Christ. I'm not promoting non-Christian music, but you get what I'm saying. I can listen to office junk, and it doesn't freak me out and make me want to quit and go find some other occupation. I can live in this dissonance because I know who I am. I know who sent me here. I know why I'm here. I know I'm on a mission. As opposed to, God, get me out of here, please, tomorrow.
So there's actually two strategies we want to pay attention to. And the first one is the strategy of Babylon, because it's going to be important to us. Because I really truly believe that the strategy that we see here in Babylon to convert, to assimilate these Hebrew children are the same ones that we live in today, the same strategies. And the first one is this. It looks like isolation. It's get them alone in a strange place, separated from community. Right? You did live in this land. You had your people. You had your way of eating. You had your culture. We're taking you out of that. We're separating you from everything that you know, and we're dropping you into this new environment. And there's something extremely powerful about getting someone alone. We know this, right? This is why police work the way they do in interrogation rooms. We're going to separate you two. We're going to put you in different rooms, and we're going to start asking you questions. And there's something about being alone that unhinges us from something really important too. I know when I feel vulnerable. And I can almost always identify when I feel vulnerable that somehow I have isolated myself or I've allowed the world to isolate me. My wife is away. Or my community, my God people community, I'm not connected to them in some way. I'm alone and I'm vulnerable.
How many people have crashed and burned on business trips, right? We're separated. So these are the strategies. We're going to look at that this week, the strategies against us, and then next week we're going to look at the strategies for us. But this week is getting us alone, getting us separated. Listen, if you find yourself alone on a regular basis, I want to say to you up front, you are living in a very risky behavior. And you may feel strong and confident, but I'm telling you, we're not designed to be alone. That's the power of community. It's the power of life groups. It's the power of gathering, the rhythm of worship.
Yeah, I want to double down on that, okay? We can be in a crowd and still completely alone. Matter of fact, when the numbers go up, then intimacy goes down, right? You could be here in a room of 400 people and not really know anyone, come and go. But if you join a life group, that's going to be really, really hard to do, right? They're going to say, that guy came into my room and he left and he never said a word. That's going to be weird. You're going to be forced to engage and to become a part of something. And that is powerful. The other thing is these things isolate us. They're supposed to bring the world together. They have not. Instead, we just look at them and we never look up at one another anymore. They're isolating. They bring us alone and they separate us from what is true and they hurt us deeply.
The second strategy against us is the enemy, or Babylon, wants to reshape your story. You notice Daniel's captors appeal to his appetites and desires. Daniel's captors start with appetites. And the strategy against us is to play our appetites, but that's not the end game. The end game is to reshape your story. You ever gone to like a 40-year high school reunion or 30-year high school reunion? And back in that day of high school, he was the football stud or quarterback, and he was lean and mean and just a playing machine, or she was the homecoming queen, whatever. And then 25 years later, you're like, whoa, life has not been good to you. You're like, oh my gosh. And you listen, and in that year of high school, they were voted most likely to succeed, and they were popular, or whatever. You know what I'm saying? And somewhere along the line, the story got changed. This is what Babylon is after, is to change our story. The enemy comes at our weakest moments and says, you deserve something better here. This isn't your story. Have you been hurt? Have you been working hard and no one recognizes it? Have you just gone unnoticed? Did you not get justice? You're a captive in a foreign land. This isn't fair. Follow me. You know, what happened to you is unjust. You deserve a better story. And here's the king's meats. Here's the king's stuff. And the bait is there. And if you think I'm stretching the point, look at the life of Jesus in the early days of his ministry. And he was led by the Spirit into the wilderness, and the enemy appeared and said, "Are you really the Son of God? Then why don't you turn these stones into bread? Because, you haven't eaten in 40 days, and that's just not fair. Your father hasn't been treating you very well. 40 days without bread. I've got these rocks, and if you'll worship me, we'll make them bread." And if he would have bid on that, it would have totally shifted his story, the reason why he was there, the mission of his father. He would have had all the bread he wanted to satisfy all the appetite he must have had. But things would have never been the same.
Imagine today the call is relevance often, right? Relevance. You got to be relevant. Imagine the strength of that call in that day to be a refugee, marched hundreds of miles to another city, hungry, and put this in front of you. And now they're going to say, "Look, this is the way it's done here in Babylon. You're going to eat kosher in Babylon? How is that even possible? We don't have kosher kitchens, dude. This isn't going to work. You're going to eat vegetables the whole time you're here? That's going to actually make you irrelevant. You're not going to have a voice into this kingdom. You're not going to be put into a place of power and position. If you want to be relevant, you got to be like us." And we have compromised ourselves for the sake of relevance, and we have lost both our consciousness and any relevant voice that we have because we sound like everybody else. That is a dangerous, dangerous step to take.
That's actually the third one against us. The strategy of Babylon is to integrate you and I into the masses. You have to be one of us in order to relate to us. I tell you, that is just such a lie. It's such a twisting of truth. And like Jason said, I think we sacrifice both our relevance and any sense of identity we used to have. We end up in what I call this miserable middle. The most miserable people I know are people that know better. If you've never known the gospel, if you've never known redemption, if you've never known the power of the cross and the fellowship of Jesus, then you don't know what you're missing. But when you've known that, and then you find yourself in Babylon just like them, but you can't totally be like them because you know what I'm saying right here? You know too much. Oh, if my mom knew where I was. Oh, I know it's not the religion of my fathers. Oh, if grandma saw me right now, she would, right? And so you're in this miserable middle. You can't really enjoy the joy and the pleasure of either one because you've been forced to think and act like the empire.
Remember, we're talking about the strategies of Babylon here. The last one is to rename. Like that speaks right to our core identity of who we are. We don't get it as much in the West as this Eastern culture, that the name was the most important thing that could be said about you. And it would take another sermon to go through what these guys' names meant, but they were all glorifying God. Every one of their names was glorifying God. And when they came into Babylon, they just changed their names a little bit. They still sounded similar, but they weren't the same, and the meaning completely changed. From glorifying God to each one of them glorifying a different deity of Babylon. And there is a powerful push on right now to both rename the group of us, the culture of us. We talked about it a little bit last week, right? You've heard these names already. You are a bigot, right? You're not a Christian. You are ignorant. You're not a believer, you are intolerant. And some of us have started to believe those names. And we've even tried to distance ourselves. Well, yeah, you're right. Some of those guys, they're those things. But not me.
Not us.
Not me.
We're kind of like a Christian Peace Corps.
Yeah, you can like me. I'm kind of cool like you. Like I sort of get it, I'm woke. Well, first I got shook and then I got woke. Look it up.
Help me out back there, would you? Isn't it interesting? The press today to be do-gooders, and I certainly want to be a do-gooder. I don't want to be a bad doer, right? But the world would love to rename us and say, just take all the Jesus stuff out, and could you just love everybody? Could you do some good works? Could you use your money to help the poor and the homeless and those kinds of things, which are all good things. But if we do those things without Jesus, then we've thrown away the whole concept of the story of eternity. And who are we? We're just here to do good on the earth? Of course we are, but we're not here just to do good on the earth. We're here to bring glory to the God who saved us and redeemed us. Listen to what Daniel said. We're going to wrap up here. The team can come. Daniel resolved not to defile himself with the royal food and wine. He asked the chief permission not to defile himself. What he was saying is he's saying, please allow me to not compromise who I am and what I believe. And I believe we will all win. We will all win. You heathen Babylon, things will go better for you, my God has promised. Me, things will go better for me. But if I compromise, we all lose. John Tyson is a pastor in Manhattan. He wrote a book on this exile thing. And he said this, I read it this week, sex, money, and power are the idolatrous trinity that defines our culture's ethical vision. Sex, money, and power are the idolatrous trinity that define our culture's vision. I'm not here to rail on our culture, but we would be foolish as pastors to not understand what you're getting up and walking into when you leave this room this morning, when you go to work tomorrow morning. It's interesting, Timothy Keller, he writes this observation. He says, the early church was strikingly different from the culture around it in this way. Around the early church, the pagan society was stingy with its money and promiscuous with its body. A pagan gave nobody their money and practically gave everybody their body. The Christian came along and gave practically nobody their body, and they gave practically everybody their money. You hear the switch? They reached out to the poor and the needy. They circled their wagons, not to hide from the world, but so that they would have something valuable to give to the world, which was called presence, the presence of God in their lives.
Imagine it like this. Anybody here kayaked before or even just canoed in a river? It's fun, right? It's particularly fun when you're going downstream. You ever turn around and try to go upstream? It's just a matter of time, right? Like, you've only got so much energy. You've only got so many power bars or so much Gatorade. Eventually, the river is going to push you downstream. You can't keep this up forever. But Daniel, he did something really important. That's the only way we're going to survive, honestly. This resolved, it means he planted himself. Otherwise, this culture that we're in, it is a river, and it is a powerful force, and it will move us along. You can say all you want, like, not me, I'm not going that way. But eventually, the time will come, it will push you along unless you have planted yourself and resolved. And let me tell you something else. The moment of temptation is not the right time to make a resolve. You better resolve before you ever get in that moment. Right? It's like going to the grocery store hungry. If I go to the grocery store hungry, I'm going to buy junk and eat it on the way home. Right? I'm going to get there and wife's like, why are there 3 chip bags open? Like, don't worry about it. I got to make a decision before I go in. No, I'm going to make good decisions in there. You got to make a decision before you ever step into the stream, before you ever step into Babylon. I'm resolved. And that has to be more than just I've made a decision. You got to be planted into something firm. Something that will not change. Otherwise, we will be moved along. Romans talks about it like this. And this is the Message, it's a paraphrased version. It says, so here's what I want you to do. God helping you. Right? This isn't up to you and your strength and your paddle arms, because they will give out. God helping you. Take your everyday, ordinary life. You're sleeping, eating, going to work, walking around life, and place it before God as an offering. Where do we plant ourselves? We plant ourselves on an altar. Embracing what God does for you is the best thing you can do for Him. Don't become so well adjusted to your culture that you fit into it without even thinking. Instead, fix your attention on God. You'll be changed from the inside out. Readily recognize what He wants from you and quickly respond to it. Unlike the culture around you, always dragging you down to its level of immaturity, God brings the best out of you, develops well-formed maturity in you.
As we finish, the question this morning is, do I feel like my life is being shaped and formed by the words and the ways of Jesus? Or has the behavior and the attitudes of my life been shaped and informed by the culture around me? That's really the question. Let me get it to you again. Have the habits and behavior and attitudes of my life, can I stand before God and say, they truly have been shaped by the words and the ways of Jesus? You know, people come to me all the time and they want an answer to a question that they want to hear yes to. Can I serve Jesus and still do X, Y, Z? And I always tell them, you're asking the wrong question. You're asking me, is it legal? If you're asking the question, is it legal? Can I still do X, Y, and Z and be saved? As kindly as I can say it, I want to tell you this morning, you're not even in the ballpark yet. If you're asking, is it legal? There's something missing in your relationship with Jesus. The question you need to be asking, is it loving? Not is it legal? Is it legal is the question of a toddler. How close can I get to the line without getting spanked or put in timeout? Right? A mature person who loves the one you're with says, I don't want to ask how close I can get to the line. I want to ask, how are we doing? I got into this because I love you, and you love me. How are we doing? How are we doing? Somehow that's the question I think we need to ask ourselves. Have I allowed things into my life that have compromised how we are doing? You and Jesus, you and I. And if I have, then the way back is not complicated, but it's not easy. It's to return to your first love. It's not to say a prayer or light a candle or give some money, get involved. No. Please don't. It's to come back to your first love. Remember where you've fallen from. The writer in Revelation would say, remember how it used to be. We're going to finish this morning with communion. As we come, the communion is around our auditorium here, and I encourage you to come. We have an open communion and take, and we're going to hold on to those elements until we're all served, and then we'll take together as we finish.